Welcome to the Comply and Outperform webinar series, where we explore the challenges, opportunities, and innovations shaping the AML and KYC landscape. Today, with my guest, Elizabeth Lease. Elizabeth is a barrister with over 2 decades of experience in financial services regulation and financial crime. She currently provides expert legal and consultancy services to governments, to regulators, and of course to private sector entities in her role as the head of regulatory law at Claritas in the Cayman Islands. I'm particularly interested to speak to Elizabeth today because from 2019, she served as the national coordinator for the Cayman Islands Anti-Money Laundering Steering Group, where she led the national response to the Financial Action Task Force 4th round mutual evaluation. And under her leadership, the Cayman Islands achieved technical compliance with all 40 FATF recommendations, thereby getting itself removed from the FATF Grey List, which was a major success in global AML remediation, particularly given, of course, the systemic importance of the Cayman Islands to global capital markets. And in recognition of her work, Elizabeth was awarded the Badge and Certificate of Honour by the Cayman Islands government in 2022. I should also add that she is an FATF assessor. She's also a certified anti-money laundering specialist, and she has served as a senior Crown Counsel in international cooperation matters. And of course, in the Cayman Islands, she also does a great deal of courtroom advocacy work spanning all levels of first trial, obviously, level and appellate level as well. Elizabeth holds an LLM in public international law with distinction, and she is also published on international criminal law and the crime of aggression. So that's a hell of a rousing introduction for you there, Elizabeth, but all of it's true. How are you? It's good to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really well, Stephen. Thanks for the invite.
Not at all. It's a real privilege for us to have you on. I know how busy you are. Now, Elizabeth, what our listeners really want to know about, what they want to learn more about, certainly, I think those who may find themselves in a position in a jurisdiction in the future, which is unfortunate enough to be grey listed. And of course, we've just had a revised list issued just last week by the FATF. They want to hear about your experience of getting Cayman off that list. So I think the natural start point is for us to ask you to cast your mind back to when Cayman was first placed on the FATF Grey List. Tell us, what were the immediate challenges that you faced back then?
So actually, Stephen, I go back a step further than that. So when the mutual evaluation was published, which was in March 2019, because of the ratings on that mutual evaluation, both in terms of technical compliance and effectiveness, these are both assessed. It was actually the effectiveness that was the issue. So if you reach certain grades on either of those two things, and in this case, effectiveness, then you're put in what's called an observation period, which gives you 1 year to do everything you can to try to meet the recommended actions in the report. So you sort of have another chance before the listing. So that was when I was appointed, when the report was published. That was March 2019. And we had a year then. We had a slight extension because of COVID, as it so happened, but for all intents and purposes, it was a year. And then the mutual evaluation report is divided into 11 immediate outcomes, and they span from money laundering investigations, national coordination, national risk, to matters such as sanctions and proliferation financing. And throughout those, there are a number of recommended actions. And in the case of the Cayman Islands, there were 63. And this figure became ingrained on all of us as we carried on and did everything we could to try to meet them. So the aim was to analyze those 63 recommended actions and work out what we could do and who needed to do what. And that in itself is quite a big task for jurisdictions, because many of these recommended actions don't apply to just one agency. So what you'll often find is you could have a really strong FIU or a really strong supervisor, but the real key is how do all of these pieces play together? So if you take, for example, sanctions, obviously it spans everyone from law enforcement, all the supervisors, how are they ensuring and monitoring that targeted financial sanctions procedures are in place, outreach to private industry. So really closely analysing each of those recommended actions in terms of what's required and who needs to do it. So that's one key and crucial task.
So Elizabeth, sorry to interrupt, just so that I can ask, just for the benefit of our listeners here. So during your period of observation, essentially, there were 64 recommendations. So you were presumably furiously trying to meet as many of those as possible in order to avoid the grey listing. But this is the period of time that we're talking about now. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So when the mutual evaluation report is first published, this period called the observation period, when you then try to do everything you can to remediate what has been found to be deficient in the mutual evaluation report.
Yeah.
So that was one key area, was analysing all of those pieces. And one thing I should mention here, Stephen, is when it comes to the grey listing, in the fourth round, the joint group, in our case, the joint group of the Americas, so there's a sort of subgroup of FATF that's looking at this, would then determine which of those actions were strategic. So in our case, and if they were not met, they were the ones that would go on the grey list. Now, in our case, we didn't know. When the report was published, nobody knew in the fourth round which ones are strategic. We could try to make an educated guess, but it was very uncertain. And really the aim was to address all of them. Now that's changing for the fifth round, because there's going to be these key recommended actions, which countries will know when their report is published. So you will know what has been determined to be key. And our aim was to remediate all of them.
Because you didn't know which were strategic.
We didn't know which was strategic. Okay. And we also didn't want to take that risk of getting it wrong. And also, we had such strong high-level political commitment. The aim was to remediate everything, which is why we also worked on the technical compliance, even though we weren't under review by FATF for the technical compliance. It was really important that we also address that. And as you said, we did that. And then we became one of the first countries in the world to be compliant or largely compliant with all 40 for technical compliance. So we did that in parallel. But our focus here in terms of the observation period was these recommended actions, which were more about effectiveness and how the law was being used as opposed to having the law in place. So one of those key points that I mentioned was to really analyse what the deficiency was, where something was not in place, who needed to remediate that, and what we needed to do. So as well as working out who needed to do what, we also had to work out how could we demonstrate that we had actually done it. So this is where things like case studies, statistics are so important, because there's no room for waffling or making sort of vague statements. It's really having that evidence that you can produce, that you're confident in, that you can speak about, that you can demonstrate that you really have met this bar. So that was sort of one piece of it. Another crucial piece was that high-level political commitment. Now, you have to have that and demonstrate it when you are grey listed. But in this observation period, it's so important, because without that driving force and that backing, you've sort of failed before you've started. So you really need the support from the highest levels to set the tone. This is a national priority. We are going to do everything we can to make sure this is remediated.
So the obvious question then is, you had a year, which was the observation period. You had these 64 recommendations. Yes, you were fighting blind because you didn't know which of them was strategic in the fourth round. I get that. It's a loaded question, this, but what went wrong? Why did you not make sufficient progress in that year such that you avoided being listed at the end of that 12 months?
So I think that's one way of putting it, what went wrong. Another way of putting it is that the jurisdiction did extremely well to meet 60 of the 63 recommended actions. So 60 were addressed or largely addressed and did not feature on the grey list. The 3 that remained were chronologically the last in the series of efforts that had to be made, because they all related to enforcement. So the joint group was satisfied that all the other pieces were in place and they didn't feature on the ultimate FATF action plan. But the 3 that remained related to enforcement by regulators, which was remediated extremely swiftly. In fact, within a few months, that one was met, which left us with 2. One related to enforcement in relation to beneficial ownership. So again, the systems were in place, the beneficial ownership was being collected. This was all done. But could we demonstrate that if people didn't provide accurate beneficial ownership, that action was being taken against them? And then the third and final one, and the one that took the longest and which is the hardest for any jurisdiction that is particularly an international financial centre, was prosecutions in line with the risk profile. So again, we'd set up the Cayman Islands Bureau of Financial Investigations, a dedicated unit within the police to focus on cross-border money laundering and matters of that nature. But the joint group wanted to see the prosecutions as is required by immediate outcome 7. And the second part to that was that you could show sentences that were proportionate and dissuasive to those types of crimes. So that was the one that took the longest. And I think for each of those 3, you can see that all the other pieces were in place. It was now implementing that final piece and showing that the enforcement was being taken.
So basically, you've just ran out of time. I mean, essentially, you got to, from 0 to 61 and 62, 63, 64. It was, you just ran out of road there. I get that, but demonstrated compliance very quickly thereafter, but not quickly enough to avoid the grey listing. Okay, really interesting. Now, did you feel that to go back to the original 64, did you think that they were fair, or did you think that there were aspects of the Cayman regime that they had misinterpreted, failed to understand, or did you feel like, no, they're right about all 64 of those?
I think there was only a few where we really thought, oh, that's not quite right. That wasn't really necessary. But nonetheless, with the high level political commitment that we had, we still worked around it and we still said, okay, well, that's not quite right. But what can we do, to make sure that, for example, with the DNFBPs, to make sure that we are doing everything we can and that we do have a strong regime, even if the specific wording is really not quite and not in line with the FATF recommendations, we are still going to try to do everything we can to make sure that the overall regime is as strong as possible. So we still did everything we could. There was none where we said, well, we're simply not going to do that.
Interesting. And which of those 64 posed the greatest challenge to Cayman?
So one that came up several times was the supervision of lawyers. And at that time, we didn't have supervision of lawyers. And that was difficult because for a country like the Cayman Islands and other countries at the time, and still in some countries now, that is a huge change between having lawyers who are not regulated for anti-money laundering and lawyers that are. Simple things like, how do we find the lawyers? How do we find the lawyers who are conducting relevant financial business, because we want to know who's within this pool that needs to be regulated, setting up the supervisor, who's going to be the supervisor, what does that look like, how do we make sure that they are sufficiently experienced and have that expertise and that they can do the supervision of the lawyers. And then, because this is all about effectiveness, making sure that they had everything in place, all their guidance, all their manuals, getting everybody registered, and then actually going and taking action. So to be actually up and running as opposed to only existing on paper. So that was a huge effort. And that was one of the ones that was achieved and did not feature on the Grey List.
Did you, how much pushback did you get from the lawyers? I mean, you tried to corral the lawyers into essentially the regulatory net. Was there a sense amongst the legal profession that that they got it and that this was so important to the national interest that, whatever they might have thought about their own sectoral interest was trumped by the national interest? Or were there people that needed to be dragged kicking and screaming? How did that play out for you?
I think a large piece of the whole effort, and across most mutual evaluation reports, is this outreach element. And this is probably a really good example of that, because to have lawyers who haven't been regulated and haven't really been involved in that framework, the outreach was absolutely crucial. So we had to go out to as many groups of lawyers as we could. We had to explain the whole FATF process, which of course was new to almost all of them. We had to explain the consequences of grey listing, what would happen if we didn't do it. And yes, as you say, Stephen, by the time we'd done that, I think we did largely find that most lawyers understood that. Of course, you had some who were in groups who were already having other officers that knew all about this and they had everything in place. But it was more the sort of sole practitioners in the Cayman Islands for whom this was new. And obviously, a burden, a large burden financially and in terms of organisation to meet what was required of the regulations. So that was a lot of outreach work that was done on that piece, which certainly helped enormously. And I think what we've seen in the Cayman Islands overall is the level of awareness now is so much higher than it was then. So, for example, we have a formal Grand Court opening at the beginning of every year. This year, it was really noticeable, front and centre, FATF. So this is, the Attorney General, the lawyers, the Chief Justice, opening the court, and you'll hear statistics about how many cases and things like that. And this year, a lot of the speeches referenced FATF and the importance of FATF and the importance of compliance. So I think we've really seen a marked increase in awareness across the board of the importance of FATF and compliance with these international standards.
Interesting. Now, before we come on to talk about how you formulated the strategic plan and the prioritization and so on, and you sort of you worked your way through this remediation. Let's just pause to talk about what was at stake here for the Cayman Islands. During that observation period, you would have been acutely aware of the impact of grey listing. What did that transpire to be, and was it as bad as you had feared?
There was a sense of fear around that. We were fairly late in the CFATF list of countries, and we'd seen other countries go through this. We'd seen their experiences and what had happened to them. There's a report by the IMF on the effects of grey listing, the reputational effect, the effect of investments into the jurisdiction, and crucially for countries such as the Cayman Islands, the effect on correspondent banking. So we were aware of all of those, and we also did a lot of work on that in parallel. We made sure that we were explaining what we were doing. We were explaining the amount of effort that was being put into this, how hard everyone was working. And ultimately, to the second part of your question, I think we were all relieved that the impact was less than it could have been. And I think that's because we had explained what we were doing. We'd explained the process. We'd explained how much work had been done, what our risk was, which was another big area in itself, that we were aware of that risk, that we were mitigating that risk. And I think also there was recognition of the fact that those last three items, as we've discussed, were merely the next in the line. They weren't things that were sort of big holes that were lacking. They were things that were going to be addressed imminently.
But I mean, it's a great answer. I get it. But were there any adverse consequences for Cayman from being grey listed?
Well, one of the consequences was that individuals, you know, we have a lot of expats here, lots of English expats, and you found people who had bank accounts, let's say with Barclays Bank, and they'd had them for, 20 years. And then they would get a call and say, well, we're going to have to do enhanced due diligence now because you are a Cayman national, country risk, Cayman's on the grey list. So that kind of thing, yes, it did happen in some countries. That is an automatic requirement. FATF doesn't require it. FATF just requires you take it into account in terms of your risk rating. So things like that did happen, but certainly not to the extent that it could have happened. And I think that was largely in recognition of the fact that this was relatively minor as these things go.
So there were consequences for Cayman nationals banking outside of Cayman, but there was no deleterious effect on Cayman's finance industry. I mean, there was no drop off in terms of inward investment, in terms of capital flows. There were no correspondent banking relationships that were brought to an end, as far as you're aware.
Yes, that's right. And the correspondent banking relationship in particular, the Monetary Authority has an excellent relationship with those correspondent banks. And that was one of the areas where a lot of work was done to reassure them, to demonstrate the commitment, and to make sure they were aware that this wasn't a huge additional risk that they were taking on, but it was that all of this action had been taken and they were reassured by that. So no, we didn't see that.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, what we wouldn't want is anybody coming away from this webinar thinking, well, frankly, it doesn't matter if you're grey listed because, Cayman has just continued to go from strength to strength despite its grey listing. That would be to give the lie to the huge amount of effort that went in to convincing not just the standard setters, but the international financial services market and all of your counterparts of the efforts that you went to during that evaluation period. I see that point. I mean, as you know, I've been spending a lot of time in the Cayman Islands over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. And having not been there for about the 7 or 8 years prior to that, and it's barely recognizable. I mean, the level and extent of growth that the Cayman Islands financial services industry has experienced over the last decade is just remarkable, in stark contrast, frankly, to that of many other international financial centers. I mean, they would, frankly, be green with envy, I think, if they really understood the extent to which your industry has continued to grow. And it seems that the FATF grey listing was but a blip in that continued growth story. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, and I think I would probably say it was more than a blip. It was an opportunity to do this huge amount of work and to demonstrate the commitment of the jurisdiction and to really propel it forward. So in 2023, the Cayman Islands was invited to be one of the first 2 members outside the main FATF body to come in as part of the initiative of the new Mexican presidency, to be invited to have a seat at the table. And I think that was partly in recognition of the fact that the Cayman Islands not only addressed those pieces that it had to address, but really embraced it and said, this is business as usual. We are doing this, and it is going to be done to a high level, and we are going to be leaders. And so it's not sort of an annoying thing that happens at the back end, but rather something that we're all aware of all the time and we're all striving for. So just going back to your previous point about we don't want to think that it didn't have any effect. That's right. It is that it was the opposite. So much work was done, so much effort was made that we managed to mitigate as best we could those remaining consequences. There was still an effect, but it was less than it could have been.
Yeah. What do you I'm asking for your subjective view on this, but what do you think the consequences for the island would have been had you failed to get off the list?
I think some of the consequences that we've seen in other jurisdictions do relate to correspondent banking, which of course can be huge and extremely damaging for a jurisdiction which relies on US currency and US currency conversion.
Yes.
The impact on the investment into the island, because investors don't want to invest in jurisdictions that are high risk, which is understandable. And so the pushback that you sometimes get from industry, and more so before than now due to this awareness piece, is that, well, everybody will leave and, this will be the end and it will never recover. And I think the answer to that is we won't recover if we don't do it. We will be in a stronger position if we do it and do it properly. And those people who wish to circumvent those requirements, who do go to another jurisdiction, are likely the persons who you didn't want to have as clients in the first place. And you may see some jurisdictions emerging as attracting those individuals, but then of course that jurisdiction becomes high risk and has to deal with the consequences of that. So there's certainly far more benefit in complying, enhancing the reputation, making sure that you have everything in place to detect bad actors and to deal with them if you do come across them. There's so much more to be gained than doing the opposite in this fear that you might lose some clients.
Yes, I get that. Now, you spoke right at the top of this interview about the distinction that the FATF draws between technical compliance and effectiveness. Critics of the FATF say that what it has done is that it's driven global convergence on anti-money laundering norms. And they give it credit for that. But they say the evaluation process is flawed because it measures intentions over outcomes. So it's driving paper reform, if you like, instead of, enforcement. I presume you would take issue with that by reference to what you described right at the top of this interview.
Absolutely. I think the way the mutual evaluation is set up in the first place, and that distinction between the technical compliance and the effectiveness, in order to demonstrate effectiveness, you have to show what I referred to earlier, the statistics, the outcomes. So if you take, for example, sentencing, what sentencing have you had? For what offences? What was the nature of the offence? What was the sentence? Was it proportionate? Was it dissuasive? So that must be an outcome there. In terms of, if you don't have those kinds of figures and examples, case examples, you won't be able to do well in that mutual evaluation. And then that becomes even more specific when you get to the joint group stage, the International Cooperation Review Group, the ICRG, when you're trying to demonstrate during the observation period, and if you are listed, that you've met those recommended actions. That's an even more intense focus on outcomes. It's all outcome driven. And in fact, the term they use is positive and tangible progress. So for example, you can't just say you've done outreach what did that outreach lead to? Who did you reach? What was the feedback? And how did it have an impact on, let's say, our outreach on how to file a high quality suspicious activity report? Yes. How can you now show that your suspicious activity report figures have improved?
So the analysis around effectiveness is really granular.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, understood. Very interesting. Let's go back then to the way in which you formulated the plan, because what's evident from the answers that you've given us thus far is that, you know, this is frankly no mean task, right? You've got a lot of observations that you've got to deal with. You've got a ton of agencies. You've got a lot of different sectors, some of which are already in the net, some are outside of the net. I mean, this is like trying to play, six-dimensional chess. You were sitting in the center of this effort and you were coordinating it. Talk us through how you developed your strategic plan. How did you prioritize the actions across government, regulators, and industry?
So I talked about identifying all the different players. And I must say, even though, as you say, I sort of sat in the middle, without having those experienced and experts members of those agencies driving things forward, no jurisdiction could achieve anything. So it's absolutely crucial that you're all working together and that you have people in each agency who are driving things forward. So we mapped out, first of all, what is the Cayman Islands AML framework? Who's supervising who, particularly with these new supervisors? Can we all have eyes on that? Do we all understand which sectors are regulated by which regulators? And then law enforcement, because of course, as well as that new bureau I talked about, you still have the Anti-Corruption Commission dealing with corruption offences. You still have the rest of the police force dealing with local fraud cases. And all of these, particularly for asset recovery, for example, they're all important to show what they're doing and bring all those figures together up to the prosecution, in our case, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and then up to the judiciary, and then the bodies, the coordinating bodies. So the Anti-Money Laundering Steering Group, chaired by the Honourable Attorney General. Then under that, the operational level body. And then we also introduced new coordinating groups, for example, a financial crime focus group, to bring together the financial intelligence unit that's receiving the SARS, the police, the prosecutor, so they could all work together and work out, how can we improve this process? Where is there any gap, anything that's not working? How do we ensure this is smooth, that things are moving forward, and that we're developing cases in line with our risk profile? And then for the supervisors, a supervisory group, where those different supervisors from our biggest regulator, which is the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority for the financial institutions and the corporate service providers, to the self-regulatory bodies, which was the new body for lawyers and for the accountants, and making sure they're all meeting. Are we all on the same page? Is there anything we can share? And importantly, are we sure that we're not at cross purposes and that we're all on the same page? And then bringing them and having them all feed up to that anti-money laundering steering group. And the other new group was the proliferation financing working group, which was really important because that was a key recommended action that we had in terms of making sure that all the relevant bodies were involved. And of course, these are different bodies to who we're usually used to working with, because now we have the shipping registry, for example, we need to bring them in. So having a chart, mapping it all out, all color coded, who's doing what, where are we, how do we all feed together? So that's a central point, and, crucial, I think, for any jurisdiction, and also really helpful for industry, so they can clearly see who's doing what and who's in charge of what. And then analysing, as I said, who needs to do what from that picture in terms of each recommended action as a whole, and then breaking it down by agency. So as well as having one overall master action plan, filtering that off into agency level action plans and having everybody report every month in a detailed manner so that you can actually analyze and challenge and ask questions about why aren't things moving forward? Why has this worked better than that? What can we do about this? So that was how we did it.
Very interesting. And was there a turning point in this long and fairly arduous process that you had to go through where you personally felt confident that delisting was within reach, or was it a constant uphill battle right up until you learned that you were off the list?
So I think the crucial moment for us was when we had the joint group meeting before the listing. And I think, we're always thinking about what needs to be done, what's next, where do we get to, and, trying to bring everyone onto the same page and working with so many different agencies. And I think when you reach a point like that and you see everyone working together, everyone's prepared, everyone's speaking on the same page, everyone's so committed to driving the Cayman Islands forward. So that was a moment when you could really see, okay, this we've done a really, really good job here. And, it was unfortunate about the last 3 actions, but also, as I said, it was a great tribute to the hard work of every single agency that 61 of them weren't there. 60, I should say, 60 of the 63 weren't there.
Was there any political fallout in Cayman as a consequence of the listing?
Not that I'm aware of. No. I think generally there was recognition and, gratitude to all the agencies for all the hard work that they've done. I mean, just one other action that springs to mind was the electronic filing at the FIU, which was a huge task because you've got all the technical aspects as well as the implementation. And then you've got sort of the parts that are in other people's hands and waiting for service providers. And that was just one small point of one recommended action. So I think there was recognition of the huge amount of work that had been done and also a very clear path forward because everybody had been working towards that goal. Everyone was clear about what needed to be done on the 3 remaining actions. And now that could be even more focused in terms of where the remaining effort lay, as well as making sure that the others carried on, because the last thing you want to do is lose all that momentum and hard work for the 5th round. But in terms of having 3 left and the focus on them, and as I said, having that first one done so quickly, we knew what we had to do on the beneficial ownership, and that was only a matter of time. And then that last one on the prosecutions took a little bit longer because it's so hard for any international financial centre.
Yeah. Now, what if you had to point to one ingredient that made Cayman successful in getting itself off the list so quickly where other jurisdictions have struggled, what would you say it was? You've talked about the political support. Obviously you need political support, you need resourcing, you need the right level of competence with people like you steering this sort of effort. But what do you think is the most important? Maybe a really unfair question, but it's important, I think, to jurisdictions who find themselves in a similar situation moving forward.
Yes, I think it is a tough question because I spoke about making sure that all the agencies are working together. But if I had to identify one, it probably would be that high level commitment, which is both in terms of political commitment as well as in terms of government level commitment. So one of the things that the Cayman Islands did, we have and have always had an anti-money laundering steering group. We then had a ministerial subcommittee on top of that, chaired by the Honourable Premier. Here we had the Premier saying this is a priority for this jurisdiction and it must be done. We had the Deputy Governor as head of the civil service in terms of recruitment and matters of that nature. As you said, this can be a big issue for jurisdictions. So we had all the different pieces in place at the highest level to ensure that wherever the gap was, it could be swiftly addressed. And it wasn't a question of then having to go and explain everything to someone else who wasn't really involved. They were sitting in the middle of it and they knew how important it was, and they were absolutely committed to getting it done. So I think we were all extremely grateful to the leadership, from the Premier to the Attorney General, the Deputy Governor, and the amount of hard work that they put in when they had so much else to do to make sure that this really was a priority out of the many competing priorities that any government has.
Yeah, so they really took ownership, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to embarrass him, but Andre Ebanks, I know, was at the centre of that. He is now your new Premier, and he's a smart guy, and he really had a sense of what was at stake here for Cayman, as a very astute politician with a background in law and financial services in Cayman. So having that empathy and understanding the pain points, I think is, I would imagine, very, very important. Now, this is a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Elizabeth, which is, do you genuinely believe that Cayman is now more resilient to financial crime as a result of this exercise, or was this primarily a sort of a regulatory compliance exercise in your view?
Absolutely more resilient, without a doubt, more resilient. So we didn't really talk about the risk assessments. And this was one of the criticisms in the mutual evaluation report, which you often see is this, and it's immediate outcome one, front and foremost. Do you know your risk? Do you understand your risk? A huge amount of work was done on that. And I'm really moving away from any idea that there's nothing to see here, there's no risk here, really focusing on what is the risk. And there's nothing wrong with having risk. What is the risk, and what are we doing about it? So things like terrorist financing, really a detailed, targeted risk assessment. What is the terrorist financing risk to the Cayman Islands? And we even did a proliferation financing threat assessment that wasn't a FATF requirement at that time. But as I said, we just did everything to make sure we were compliant. And because everybody just wanted to get it done and get it right. So we did that as well. And that was really interesting because, of course, for the Cayman Islands and other international financial centres, lay people would say, well, what are you talking about? We didn't have any terrorism. We didn't have any proliferation. And we did so much work on that and really focusing on the understanding of the movement. It's the movement that can affect us. We're very fortunate not to have any terrorism incidents, no collection of terrorism funds, no using terrorist funds. But we really need to focus on the movement. What are we doing about that? How are we making sure that nothing's moved through? And once you increase that understanding, you also get the buy-in because everyone says, well, we definitely don't want that. So you move from doesn't happen here to, oh, that could happen. And we definitely don't want that to happen. What lists are we looking at? How are we making sure we're aware of the countries? How are we making sure we're aware of neighbouring countries, supply countries in the case of proliferation financing? How are we making sure that we understand the risk so that we're not simply looking through a list, which of course we're often not finding hits on? We're actually trying to find out who's behind the client. Are they related to the list? So I think in terms of understanding and therefore increasing the width and breadth of the involvement of the industry and of course the competent authorities, that must be a better way to detect and prevent financial crime.
Very interesting. You've talked about the beneficial ownership question a few times so far today. Just for the benefit of our audience, where did Cayman land on the question of beneficial ownership and the register?
So are you talking about public access?
Yes.
Right. So public access is outside FATF. So in terms of FATF, we also always had a multi-pronged approach. So we have regulator, ensures regulated entity is collecting. Then we have our registrar, ensures that companies are providing and that it's collected by the registrar. And so we had all that in place. And then the remaining question, as I said, was enforcement in terms of accuracy, which is very difficult. And we achieved that. Separate question in terms of public access. The Cayman Islands has recently introduced legislation for legitimate interest access. So we have that in place. Slightly prior to that, legislation was introduced for protection for those who wish to reach the test, to ensure that if the legitimate access test was met, their particular details wouldn't be released in terms of, for example, kidnapping risk. In terms of legitimate access, because it's fairly new, we haven't yet seen it tested in the courts, but there are various routes for legitimate interest access, including journalists, if they meet a specific test, which broadly speaking relates to the prevention and detection of money laundering.
Yeah. Is there a sense in Cayman of the inevitability of transparency, beneficial ownership registers in the years to come?
I think there's an acceptance of the fact that we need to show transparency to the same extent that is expected globally, and we are absolutely willing to do so. And you mentioned the Honourable Premier Andre Ebanks. He wasn't the Premier during the observation period, but came in after that and was, as you say, a real leader and driver of ensuring that the Cayman Islands was at the fore of making sure that we were seen and recognised for all the work that was done. And he really led the Beneficial Ownership Transparency Act that is now in place, that will serve the Cayman Islands extremely well in the 5th round because of all the work that's been done. So I think there is a recognition, and I think we're now at that place where, as is accepted globally, if you need to see that register, you can see that register, but it's not simply open to all.
Interesting. I mean, all sorts of noises continue to come from London about this issue, so it obviously, I think, remains in flux. But as you say, the Cayman position is, well, you're going to do what's required to be done, but I guess the issue of continuing to compete on a level playing field is what's important. Yeah. Now,
absolutely.
How is Cayman maintaining the momentum to ensure that there's no danger of sort of slipping back into non-compliance? I mean, you see this in a lot of jurisdictions. There's this huge effort, such as you've described. The pendulum swings all the way over here. You get yourself off the list, or you get a compliant assessment, and then everybody relaxes, and the pendulum seems to swing all the way back in the opposite direction until there's some mad, crazy rush in the 12 months leading up to the next evaluation. But you get this sort of 2 or 3 year dead period where nothing happens, and then everybody starts scrabbling around to do what needs to be done all over again. Is there a danger of that in Cayman, or are you seeing this continuing forward momentum?
So obviously now I'm not in government, I'm on the outside looking in, but what I certainly can see is, as we've spoken about, Honourable Premier Andre Ebanks leading the charge. He's just attended the FATF plenary. So again, as we said earlier, competing demands, but still went and showed the commitment and dedication of the Cayman Islands to that cause, having been provided with a seat at the table, which again, I think is a recognition of the hard work that the Cayman Islands has done. We have seen recruitment for a national coordinator. So my position was a temporary one put in place for the observation period. And then for the grey listing, now that will be a permanent position. So I expect we'll see a permanent body that will sit and take on that role, which is so crucial, Stephen, as you say, to make sure that it's kept up throughout the years and not something that comes and goes with an evaluation. And having spoken to, people in industry and seen the extreme hard work of, for example, the Financial Intelligence Unit, because we've just brought in consent SARs, which is another massive change for the Cayman Islands, whereby if you file a SAR, that isn't any longer simply a defence. You must file a SAR and then await that you are told you have consent to continue with whatever activity it was that you planned to do, if a defence against money laundering is required. And we've seen the director, RJ Berry, again, in terms of outreach, at every event, every outreach, making sure that industry is aware, that they know what's required, that they know what the expectations are. So certainly, even from the industry side, we're seeing the work continue.
Interesting. And point I want to finish on, Elizabeth, because we're up against time here, is, there are naysayers, and there will have been throughout the process that you stewarded, that would have said, hey, complying with all of these standards is not in our interests as an industry. It's analogous really with the private sector. There are people within the private sector that continue to say, well, let's just take the risk. If we get caught, then we'll deal with that. But the costs of acting in a non-compliant way are not as great as the costs of not doing this business. Okay, we're very familiar with that refrain that you hear from certain quarters of industry. But to the naysayers, I guess what the Caymans can point to is that having put itself at the forefront of the fight against global anti-money laundering, business has not dropped off a cliff. It has not put itself, it seems to me, at a competitive disadvantage by being in full compliance. My assessment of what we're seeing there is that it seems to be going from strength to strength. I mean, would you agree with that assessment?
I'd absolutely agree with that. Not only have we seen the decline, we've also seen the fact that you can promote this well-regulated industry, which is often what investors are looking for. How can I be satisfied that my investment will be dealt with properly, that it's safe? We always had the courts, and the courts of the Cayman Islands are extremely highly regarded. But then to also have this recognition that globally we've met these standards and, we're well regulated. We don't accept bad players, we take action against them. Then I think that's a recognition that not only we haven't seen people fall away, we also use to attract new investments.
It's very interesting. And I can certainly attest to the seriousness with which certain organizations continue to take this as an issue, from the investment that they're making actually in cutting edge, innovative sort of technologies. So, I've seen this with my own eyes, and clearly the level of awareness of the importance of and the criticality around AML compliance is certainly something that people speak to me a great deal about in your jurisdiction. So, well, Elizabeth, I wish we had more time, actually, because it's a fascinating conversation. It really is. I know that you are engaged in your professional capacity now, helping other jurisdictions to get themselves off the list, or indeed to avoid getting on the list in the first place. So all of that first-class experience you've had in Cayman is being put to good use elsewhere. And I'm very conscious of how busy you are. So I'm super grateful that you shared the time with us today. I'm sure everybody will find this really hugely useful. And if you do, listeners, find yourself in a jurisdiction that could do with the expertise of somebody like Elizabeth, then I frankly, it seems to me that you could do a great deal worse than giving her and her colleagues at Claritas a call. Elizabeth, thanks so much for your time. I'll catch up with you next time I'm on island.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for all the questions, and I look forward to seeing you in person next time.
Cheers, Elizabeth. Bye. See you soon. Bye. Thank you for attending today.
We look forward to welcoming you on our next Comply and Outperform webinar.